Hey, Next Economy Now listeners. If you followed our podcast for long, you've probably heard about the Next Economy MBA. What you might not know is that we wrote a book about it, and it's coming out on May 23rd. The Next Economy MBA book combines our experience working with Next Economy organizations and over 400 alumni that have taken our course. It's designed for impact leaders who seek to develop a business strategy from a socially just and environmentally regenerative perspective. This book is a great way to dive deeper into the principles and case stories we discuss on the podcast, and includes a workbook to put learnings from the program into practice. You can pre-order a copy for yourself or a friend at lifteconomy.com/MBA book. Thanks for listening, and now on to the show.
Welcome to the MBA Series. This is a special multi-part series within Next Economy Now. We are going to review the arc of the learning journey that is presented in the Next Economy MBA online course. We are open sourcing the content from our course and hope to share it in this shorter, bite-sized format. We are launching this series because we were asked to do it by listeners like you. We're also doing it because we are writing a book entitled The Next Economy MBA, Redesigning Business for the Benefit of All Life, which will be published on May 23rd, 2023 by Barrett Kohler Publishers. This is a sizable series. There will eventually be 18 podcast episodes of course content and 9 interviews with MBA alumni. We will be rotating every other week with our normal Next Economy Now interview format. We hope you enjoy it. Please reach out to us via our website, lifteconomy.com, with any comments, feedback, or requests. And now, on with the show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to session 18, which is Strategy 3, Partnerships and Governance from the Next Economy MBA podcast series. And today we're going to be delving into strategy and partnerships and governance. I'm here with Kevin Bayuk, my business partner at Lift Economy, and I'm Ryan Honeyman, also a partner and worker owner at Lift Economy. Kevin, any quick words to say before we jump in?
Excited to dig in.
Great. So today we're first going to talk about decision-making and governance. And so if you listen to the last section, we're still within this broader framework of strategy within the larger framework of the sort of MBA. And we're going to move away from finance and sort of introduce the topics of decision-making, governance, and partnerships. And you might be thinking, why are decision-making and governance part of strategy? It's because, how your company makes decisions, how responsibility and authority are delegated, and how proposals are generated are all strategic choices. So the first thing we can talk about is some of in our MBA book, we talk about the first thing is like meetings and just like the reasons to meet. And a lot of people have terrible meeting hygiene. A lot of people don't come prepared to meetings. And one of the best reasons to meet is to make decisions about available alternatives. So one of the things we talk about in the MBA is how decisions are about creating shared power in a more equitable and democratic culture. And two of the types of decision makings we talk about are things like majority voting, and then consensus, which is like everyone must agree in order for something to move forward. What's surprising to people is that this isn't the only two options. So it's not like you can only do consensus, everyone has to agree, or the majority wins. That's actually a spectrum. So some of the spectrum things are things like supermajority voting, consent, modified consensus, which is also known as consensus -1, advice process, et cetera. And we can get into some of those. But one of the most important parts of some of those pieces is the delegation of decisions. So you have the decision-making process, and then it's important to think about so who is making them and what is the process? So one complaint we often hear from egalitarian organizations is this idea of requiring consensus or even consent on every decision is a very high standard, and it can really bog down your decision making. So one of the things we have in our MBA online course is a decision zone chart, which can be useful to sort of get more efficient and streamlined. So in a decision zone chart, you kind of list the different stakeholder groups, identify what kind of decisions they might make, identify the method and mechanism they use to make the decisions, and then you can sort of delegate authority and power. So that's one thing we sort of like to get into is just like, for example, if you're a worker-owned cooperative, you might have the owners setting the sort of vision or mission and culture of the company. And the way to get about that, to sort of get to that is maybe, you might need consensus, like everyone agrees. But in something like, creating and implementing strategy for projects, it might just be the team leads and it might be more of advice. Like you sort of ask advice from people, but you don't need consensus to move that forward. So it's really helpful to have a decision zone chart just to really get a sense of what can be most effective for your type of company. And I'm curious, Kevin, what's coming up for you in this discussion? And
yeah, I think I would underscore a few things that I think are critical when we meet with next economy oriented organizations wanting to express next economy principles and in alignment with kind of next economy values. And we kind of ask, like, so what's your decision making process? Like, in many cases, the answer is actually, we're not sure, or we don't have one. Or maybe, like you said, there's kind of the default to the more well-known mechanisms of we vote on issues as a board or as a group, or we, have to strive for consensus. But in most cases, there's like, we don't really know. And without knowing or being explicit about the process, what tends to happen is dominant culture power paradigms tend to take over. And that oftentimes means the white people or the men or whatever the dominant culture patterns are tends to seep in and express itself. So power gets ossified into the structures that are reflective of society at large. And so next economy values imply, and the principles, right, that we want an equitable and democratic process to arriving at choices or decisions. So being explicit, and it doesn't have to be a chart, but a system, having some place where it's like, this is actually how we make decisions, and articulating that's a very strategic choice of like determining how you make decisions. And then there's a whole another part of practice and hygiene, which we'll talk about in a moment, I'm sure. But I think a chart is really useful, or again, if maybe some people listening here are interested in some of the systems that exist, like sociocracy or holacracy, there are systems of governance that have basically broken the standard power paradigm hierarchy for decision making and business as usual is the boss makes the decision. It's basically fiat. So if you want to have a more horizontal, more communitarian, more collective, more shared power decision-making process, it's helpful to actually have a process identified. Because if you don't have one, then the implicit power structures will tend to take over. And you'll run into the process of like the experience of all we do is meet. And this is the hygiene piece, which we'll talk about. All we do is meet and talk about things, and it's too slow. We never get to a decision, a choice. And so there's these processes. And what you mentioned, Ryan, is one of those keys to build efficiency into a non-hierarchical, more horizontal, more shared power organization is this concept of delegative authority. And a chart or, a clear purpose to the circles within the organization depending on what process you use, actually writing out like these are the domains of decisions. These are the types of decisions that this group can make. And you won't be able to anticipate all of the possible decisions that any group of stakeholders might make, but being as clear as possible, as explicit as possible, allows for more autonomy and freedom for delegative authority or decision making at the edges, if you will. More autonomy of the individuals involved. But it also, there's a side effect, second order effect of that also requires accountability structures. We could talk about that too. So freedom, the kind of the price of freedom in decision making is like, oh, I actually now I'm accountable as well. And so there is another side to the equation. But I would say one more thing about these delegative authority structures that I think is important in terms of setting up your chart. And again, if you're using sociocracy or another system, the more important the decision, the more stakeholders you want to have involved. Also, probably the higher the bar on that spectrum from majority wins voting, where minority loses, majority wins voting, versus, consensus, where it's everybody agrees. The more important the decision, like, should we sell the organization? Big question. The more stakeholders, you want to have more stakeholders involved rather than less, and probably have a higher bar for, agreement on a choice between alternatives. So that's one guideline you could use for designing your delegative authority system.
One thing I wanted to pull out of there is you talked about the accountability piece. And I think for a lot of egalitarian organizations, it's like, we want to not have this hierarchical boss structure where, so let's not have a boss, or like maybe let's be, flat organization or self-managing. And then it's like, so I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this. But what's missing often is accountability, because if you just have, in many ways, a boss holds you accountable. Did you do your thing? That's, one piece of a hierarchical relationship. Did we do this thing I assigned you? When you don't have a boss telling you to do something, how do you still maintain that accountability? And what we've seen at Lyft is one part of it is to be very explicit about all the different tasks that you're specifically responsible for. So writing out in great detail, like, I am responsible for sending out the monthly newsletter on the second Wednesday of every month at 10 a.m. And a lot of companies feel like that's too much detail, but it's much easier to be accountable if everyone's tasks are transparent to each other. And you can say, hey, I'm clearly responsible for writing the monthly newsletter, because if it's not written out, then who knows if you're accountable to it? So I don't know if you'd add anything to that, Kevin.
Yeah, a system of specificity is the prerequisite number one for communitarian culture accountability. A culture of accountability has to be very specific. Otherwise, it's too easy to say, like, he said, she said, they said. It's not clear what was the person was responsible for. Second, I'll add in quickly, we might talk about this in the next episode in more detail. So accountability, there's other pieces to it. There's this thing of like, if you have a warm, loving, familial environment as like the culture of a non-hierarchical, we want to get rid of the boss kind of thing, which again is in alignment with the next economy values, then holding somebody accountable becomes really difficult, because accountability, for most people in their upbringing and training, accountability just means punishment, or punishment and reward. And so the system of specificity is first. Second order is greeting a lapse in, not completing a task with support, the presumption of support. Like, okay, you didn't do the newsletter. What support do you need? The presumption that some support is needed, and that could lead to training or development or more capacity or removing certain tasks or adding tasks, adding other things. The support is the presumption so it's an accountability with the presumption that support is needed. And then the third piece is consequences, which is a very detailed thing, which we could either talk about in another episode or in the facilitated session we go into that.
I have a proposal, Kevin.
Go for it.
I propose that we talk about crafting effective proposals. What do you think? So one of the things that was really shocking for me when I joined Lyft was Kevin taught me about this famous words, I propose that, ... And the whole idea is to give one reason that meetings take forever and decision making can feel frustrating is that it's helpful to give people a choice between alternatives instead of, excessively analyzing, assessing, and expressing internal experiences. So one cut through we've developed at Lyft is asking folks to say, I propose that, and then that being a forcing function to help move the conversation past the expression of someone's internal experience to a choice between alternatives. Admittedly, there's a tendency to avoid this type of language, though, because there's a fear your proposal might be rejected. But without proposing a choice between alternatives, meetings could go on for a long time. So there's a component in there around, is it safe enough for people to be rejected in their proposals, but it's actually a healthy hygiene thing to have. And what we want to get to is this, this range of tolerance. So for example, another 3-word sentence that Kevin helped me learn about is this question, is it workable? So for example, Kevin might say, I propose that we spend an extra 10 minutes in a particular meeting. And I might say, I don't actually want to spend another 10 minutes in a meeting. But that sort of feeling of not wanting to do it, we want to try to broaden a range of tolerance with an idea of, is it workable to spend an extra 10 minutes in this meeting? And it's like, yeah, I don't really prefer spending 10 more minutes, but it's workable for me to do it. And what that does is it sort of allows you to move beyond all or nothing. Like, I don't want to do this, yes or no. Can we meet extra time? Can we adopt this project? Can we do this instead? Asking, is it workable, sort of helps move this idea of like, let's move collectively around like what's good enough rather than seeking perfection, because that can really take forever and really be debilitating to egalitarian organizations. Would you add anything else, Kevin?
Maybe just underscore a couple of things that you said that I think are really important. We talked a bit earlier about decision making, so making a choice between alternatives, but like you said, upstream from that is actually the dialogue and deliberation to arrive at a choice, the ability to make a choice. What are we talking about? And where a lot of communitarian groups, co-ops, et cetera, get stuck is in this cycle of dialogue and deliberation. And so the cut through, like you said, the building a culture that is able to definitely have dialogue and deliberation is really important to brainstorm possibilities, to understand, to clarify the context. Context is really important. I mean, there is some time that's required there, especially with more stakeholders involved, actually doing background, like how did we get to this place, making sure there's shared literacy, shared understanding. And nonetheless, instead of taking forever to then kind of externalize our internal emotional impressions about something and have dialogue go forever, a proposal is a cut through. And there is, when you mentioned something of like, we can be afraid of rejection, which can limit our ability to create proposals. It's kind of a funny thing that we try and train people on, both in the Next Economy MBA and in our client work, is to actually change how we hold the idea of a proposal. For example, I'm now at the point where if I make a proposal and it passes without, everybody consents to it without any like modification, I actually feel sad, like I'm let down. Like it means my team is not diverse enough, or they actually didn't really consider the proposal well. They haven't actually thought it through. And so having cognitive abrasion, having proposals go out and have them being hopefully slightly modified. I still want to make a proposal that moves the conversation forward. And I want to craft one that gives some alternatives to push against. But I'm always more satisfied when I share a proposal for a choice and somebody modifies it and another person modifies it a little bit. And that gives me the comfort of like, wow, yeah, we have diverse perspectives on this team that actually arrive at something that's better than what I, in my own mind, might have conceived of. And so actually holding proposals, like you said, Ryan, it has to be safe enough, psychological safety, but actually practicing making proposals that are like, quote unquote, bad. Making proposals that you know will fail is actually can be helpful for some people to be like, I propose that we take the next 5 months off. Like, what? And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but actually creating a term, a stake in the ground, as they say, for the rest of your group to push against can actually be helpful for moving the conversation forward. It's actually one methodology of leadership when we talk about leadership in co-ops and group organizations. And what Ryan described in terms of the workability and the range of tolerance is especially important for consent-based cultures. So we talked about consensus, everybody has to agree. We talked about voting, minority loses, majority wins. Consent, which, sociocracy also champions this, kind of looks for that workability. I might not agree with it totally, but I also don't need to dissent. It's not going to really harm the organization or harm myself, or I don't believe it's going to create harm. So it's workable for me. And that's kind of like a pro tip for like finding proposals that can be consented to. Sometimes there's modifications that can help of like using time. So like, okay, I mean, let's put it this way. I've almost never seen a perfect proposal in the thousands and thousands of meetings that I've participated in different co-op settings or, communitarian settings. I've almost never found a perfect proposal. It always has some wrinkle. And so again, that could lead to a spiral, a meeting that goes forever. But one of the kind of hacks or approaches to make things more workable is like, what if instead of this being permanent, we tried it for 90 days? Is that more workable? What if we tried it for 30 days? So some decisions that seem permanent, shortening the experiment, making it an experiment so that we can get more information to make a better proposal next time can be a helpful way to move organizations through, especially if they're feeling stuck around a cycle of dialogue and deliberation that's just not resulting in moving forward.
I love it. And we're not going to get into it here, but it's worth saying that if your meetings are constantly thrown off and your governance is constantly thrown off, there may be some deeper work to be done around like, what are the dynamics of the team that simply having proposals and asking if it's workable are not addressing. So I would just say as a note to folks that feel like some of their team dynamics might be, really challenging. There can be like sort of underlying things that need to be addressed. Why don't we spend a couple minutes on strategic partnerships, kind of a little bit of a random shift away from governance, but strategic partners, we're still within strategy. And so, one thing we often speak with companies about as well is partnerships are this idea of, helping your organization, not necessarily one way, it can be mutually beneficial to provide your organization's goods or services. So, for example, when co-ops, nonprofits, and other social enterprises come to us and tell us they're running into roadblocks, we often ask them to describe their partnership strategy. So you might think, okay, that's interesting. For example, if a client organization thinks they need to spend more money on advertising in order to increase their sales and distribution, we might first prompt them to describe who they're partnering with to get the word out and how they might think about that in terms of getting their product distributed. And a lot of clients that we work with do not have a partnership strategy. So we, in the MBA and also in our consulting work, we help them formulate this and make it an integral part of their business. So this kind of directly ties back to this next economy principle number 4 of supporting local communities. So this idea of cultivating local partnerships for supply, distribution, banking, or other services can be really critical. And sourcing locally with your strategic partnerships is counter to the business as usual trend of outsourcing your services to exploited labor in some other country, for example. And then we can talk about getting invited in and like how you actually create partnerships. Kevin, is there anything to add just on this sort of broader topic?
Yeah, maybe a little bit just in terms of, when we talk about strategy in the Next Economy MBA training, one of the connections here is that we organize the whole training on like, what are the failure points that we see when we work with clients out in the world. And like you mentioned, Ryan, when we meet an organization that's getting going or growing and we say, what's your decision-making strategy? What's your strategic decision in terms of your decision-making process? They say, oh, we don't have one defined. It's like, oh, okay, kind of like red flag. And then similarly, like, what's your partnership strategy? Like, oh, we don't actually have one. Okay, another red flag, because in next economy organizations, in addressing the price parity paradox, oftentimes it's not a question of how do we do this. The big reframe is, who do we need help from to do this? The how to who is a big shift in reframe that we think is really critical, because the next economy in its unfolding is a federated network of aligned impact organizations and institutions that are transforming the very nature of the economy and the culture of society. And so the who, actually having a way to develop partnerships, to strategically identify values aligned partners that you can grow with and develop each other, inform each other, is kind of actually a prerequisite, or is essential to the success of the whole next economy movement, and likely any single next economy organization.
Can you tell your story about Starhawk and like getting invited in, and that's key to building partnerships?
Sure. Yeah. There's critical question that comes up when thinking about strategic strategy for partnerships is, you might identify a group or organization or community that you want to partner with, and maybe even you want to support in some way. And there's a big question mark that everybody should check in on, is like, am I part of that community? Am I already affiliated? Am I connected? Do I have rapport? And this is especially true for avoiding some of the horrible patterns of white saviorism and so forth, where white people are like, ooh, I want to partner with more diverse groups that I'm not a part of. And that can create harm. And what I've learned from some of my mentors and friends is what sometimes is referred to as by invitation only, or bio partnership. By invitation only kind of means that instead of the question of like, how do I partner with this group, or how do I help, the prerequisite question is actually like, how do I get invited to help? I only go where I'm invited, where there's an interest in connection. And so there's kind of a stepping back moment of like, okay, well, how do I get invited? And that is a different question in terms of partnership development. It could lead to different outcomes, and often at times means listening. So there's a lot of, just basic humility here of like listening, empathy, understanding what the people, the community, the group that you want to partner with, what are their priorities? What are they trying to achieve? What are they working on? And rather than trying to enroll them in your agenda as your means of helping, it would be the first humbling step, like taking the time to support their agenda, understand their agenda, and seeking those ways to help. And if you can find those ways to help, building rapport might take time. In fact, it might take years. In fact, it might take decades. And so I think those are really important considerations for a partnership development strategy, of making sure that you have the patience and the humility and an approach. I'm not trying to say don't try and partner and don't try and help. I think it's really strategic. But there are missteps that can happen in trying to partnership. So it could be helpful to have a structure. So in the Next Economy MBA facilitated training, we have a few templates for ways to think about the types of strategic partnerships, in terms of what you might be able to provide to a partner in terms of information, or access to a market, or building their reach, or access to resources, or supplies, or material. Looking for, I know it's a cliche, but looking for the shared benefit, or the win-win, where the partner is going to benefit kind of first, and then you would also benefit as well in terms of what you're trying to develop and how you're looking to grow. And so in terms of finding partners, there's some tactics that we talk about in the Next Economy MBA. Looking for groups that are already serving the community that you are intending to serve and support, or already working with. And looking for signs of aligned vision and values. there's some basic skills that are important that can be trained, but again, almost cliche, almost business as usual terminology here, but like continuous networking. A lot of next economy entrepreneurs are, justifiably so, very wrapped up in delivering the goods and services, into taking care of their community in the best way they know how. And there's a lot of focus on their own work and building a habit of extending the network of relationships kind of continuously, proactively, not in just a reactive mode. All of a sudden I have a need and it's like, oh, now I have to go find a partner. It's kind of preemptively, continually building the network is really critical. Understanding, and we've mentioned earlier, the listening and understanding of the needs of the partner is a practice in empathy and communication. Confirming alignment in vision and values, which can look like, again, these sound like business as usual things, but like actually articulating a memorandum of understanding. We have templates that we share in the Next Economy MBA, but MOUs that just like say, hey, here's our values, and here's your values. Here's our vision. Here's your vision. Here's what our needs are. Here's what your needs are. Here's what we can try to do to help. Here's what you can try to do to help. And actually writing it out for effective partnership development. It might sound so like, that I can't believe we have to document everything and articulate it that way, but effective aligned partnerships that become hopefully multiple generations in their expression take that type of like articulation and trust and rapport building. So all those are things that we emphasize, and it's very strategic of finding the who and finding the partners for success, because this next economy, the growth of transforming the economy to work for the benefit of all life is going to take a federated, connected, integrated approach amongst many groups, many institutions to actually effectuate a full culture change. And too many groups that we've connected with don't actively invest in partnership development because it takes time, takes effort, and it takes attention.
Thanks, Kevin. Do you want to take us out with any last closing thoughts?
I think just that in this world of strategy, in terms of governance and partnerships, there's training, there's skills to develop. And one of my great friends and colleagues, Pandora Thomas, says, meet people where they're at, but don't leave them there. And so this idea that we're all entering, dynamic, collaborative governance from a different stage of our experience. Most humans I've met have little to no lived experience making collective decisions with other humans. Their father or mother told them what to do. Their teacher told them what to do. Their boss told them what to do. And now you bring them to an environment where it's like, hey, we're going to actually collaborate together and make decisions together. That's very foreign to a lot of people, not everybody for sure, but in affluent rural culture, like making collective decisions is largely unknown. Being in council is largely unknown. And so without a lot of experience, it could take some time. And it's part of our, personal growth and development principle of Next Economy to like actually work on each other to practice making decisions together. And any place you can find that practice, it has the potential to ripple out into your family, into your community, into your neighborhood, maybe even our, nation states and, the way we collaborate as a society. So the quote unquote Trojan horse message of collaborative governance in an organization is it has the potential to be transformative to our lives.
Well, thanks everyone for listening. Thanks, Kevin. Folks, we have dipping into organization and operations next time, organization structure, roles, and tasks. So get into some of that nitty gritty around accountability and responsibilities and roles, which we briefly alluded to today. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.